Hello, my name is Oscar Fire, and welcome to how do I describe this video? I guess it's another one of those rambly, ranty videos I do periodically, like with The Last Jedi. We're not going to talk about that one though. But we're gonna do a little bit of a rambly, ranty here video because I just finished a book series and I am frustrated. So, for a little bit of history, a little bit of backstory, back when I was like in 7th grade, I think, 7th into 8th grade, I started reading like more high fantasy novels. That's when I first read The Hobbit, and then I read The Lord of the Rings. I think I read those both in 7th grade. And when I was done with those, I started reading the Shannara books by Terry Brooks. Bear in mind that here I was the only Shannara books I was particularly familiar with were the ones my mother had bought at the time. So that was like the original Shannara trilogy, the Signs of Shannara, the First King of Shannara. Those were really the only ones I knew about. And of course, if any of you are familiar with the Shannara series covers a couple dozen books over like 4, 5, 7, 8 different book series, mostly trilogies with a handful of odds and ends here and there. And I started reading them, and I really liked it. I mean, it helps that I had just come off the Lord of the Rings, and the Sword of Shannara, Lord knows, the Sword of Shannara is basically just kind of, not a ripoff, but Terry Brooks, because it was his first major novel, he lifted very heavily from the Lord of the Rings for the overall composition of the book and the like the plot, the characters. There's a lot of elements there that are lifted, not wholesale, but lifted very, they're ultimately very similar to the Lord of the Rings. I think that helped to kind of like get me drawn in, but it wasn't until like the Elfstones of Shannara, the second book he wrote, that the series starts to take on a life of its own. And by the way, if you have never read the Shannara series, A, I recommend it. B, there's going to be lots of spoilers. So if you ever want to read it, if you're ever considering reading it, or if you take that recommendation on board, I suggest that you not actually listen to this video, because this video is definitely about if you know the entire mythos, the entire arc. You've read all the books, all the series, and everything. Because I really want to talk about the last series, but I kind of want to talk about the previous two ones before this as well, the previous two trilogies. So yeah, there's your spoiler warning, because I'm about to really get into it. Not really get into it, because this is not going to be very coherent or organized, like pretty much anything I do that's rambly and ranty. So I just finished the what's the word? What would the word for a 4-part book series be? I feel like quadrilogy is not a word, but I mean, it works. It's just kind of invented it. I don't know. I could be wrong. I should look that up after this. Anyway, so I finished reading this, the 4 books, the Black Elf Stone, the Scar Invasion, the Steel Assassin, and the Last Druid. And all right, so first things first, something I really want to kind of get out of the way is talking just about, generally speaking, Terry Brooks and how he's written recently. Because it started with the Dark Legacy of Shannara, which is the third to last trilogy. And the second to last trilogy was the Defenders of Shannara, and then finally the Fall of Shannara. And I don't know if I just don't remember how Terry Brooks wrote like the previous books, all the previous series, from the Sword of Shannara trilogy to the Signs of Shannara, Voyage of Gerald Shannara, Genesis of Shannara, Word and Void. I don't know if I just forgot how he wrote those, but it feels like over like the past 10 books, his writing style has degraded. Like, his writing style has just fundamentally gotten worse. And by what I mean by that is that it's gotten very clumsy. The writing reminds me kind of sort of what you would expect actually out of like a young writer. Like someone who's a teenager in their early 20s, someone who doesn't really have a grasp of the fundamentals of like how you would write things, not necessarily like the stories and like the storytelling and everything, or the character development or anything. Though I think that's an issue here too. but more so the fundamental mechanics of your grammar and phrasing and descriptions and dialogue. Because there's something about like these last three series that comes across as extraordinarily clunky. I really probably should have looked this up. I feel I probably should have looked up like a spot in these books where this is kind of where it's kind of obvious, because there's spots all over the place. Because there's spots in the books where he just kind of like something will happen, right? Like an event will happen, and then like a character who is absent for that event will come up, and for whatever weird reason, Terry Brooks will write it so that he explains the character who experienced the event, explaining it back to the character who was absent, but he'll like write it off in a weird listicle sort of way where it's like, you know, like I explained, like where he just describes like the exact order in which all the events that you literally just read about, like at most like a chapter or two before, but sometimes even a page or two before, he'll explain it back again in like a weird little list format. And it's so baffling because it's such a clumsy way to write that. Because something I've been doing recently is that if none of you remember, technically even though I work in retail and everything, I'm technically a university graduate, and I studied English primarily. And I have an editor's brain. When I read things, I have a tendency to kind of subconsciously edit it in my head if it's written poorly, you know, if it's not written smoothly, if there's weird clunky things in it. And I found myself doing that a lot with The Fall of Shannara. I found myself constantly going back through and re-editing how Terry Brooks wrote it, because I couldn't figure out why he wrote it so clumsy. I couldn't figure out why he would explain certain details, or why he would have like certain sentences like written the way he did, why he would have dialogue that was very, what's the word? The dialogue is unnatural. There's a lot of dialogue that's just flat out unnatural. Like normal people don't talk this way, because it's just kind of long-winded and wordy, and it's very frustrating. For lack of a better word, it's very frustrating for someone like me who looks for like, who when he's reading, prefers the writing to be smooth, to flow, to have a sort of natural cadence to it, to have a sort of just to be natural. And that's missing. That's very missing in these books. And I think that's unfortunate because it definitely detracts from the experience. And it's kind of like, well, you remember me talking about The Last Jedi. Part of the problem with The Last Jedi, of course, is that so many things are kind of, and I think with the sequel trilogy in general as we go into it, but the problem with The Last Jedi especially, though, was that when you found one thing wrong, it inevitably would result in you finding more things wrong, because when something is wrong in a story, whether it's the storytelling, the characters, the world building, the writing, what happens is that it pulls you out of the experience. You become less immersed with the story, and you start to notice more things wrong. If there's more cracks, that is. If there's more cracks in the story, you start to notice that more things are wrong in the story. And there's a lot more things wrong in The Fall of Shannara than just the storytelling. And the same thing, and the same thing that happened in The Last Jedi is happening here. So I guess I kind of want to get into what's wrong with the plot. And I think in the most fundamental level, a big part of this is that there's a lot of member berries in The Fall of Shannara. There's just lots of little elements that are thrown in, sprinkled in, that actually occurred in previous books that get repeated again here. And in ways that don't feel very meaningful or substantive. For example, the very beginning of the Black Elf Stone, basically there's a foreign power. For those of you who don't know, I guess anyone who's read this or intends on reading it will know. But for those of you who don't care, Shannara is basically Earth. Earth, like the full Shannara, by the time 4,000, the full Shannara, it's like 4,000 or 5,000 years into our future. After like World War III, everything's been destroyed. Magic is back in the world, and the Scar are and a nation called the Scar are invading the world of Shannara, and they're Scar from across the sea over basically what would be Europe, and they're invading what is, North America. That's where Shannara is set. And the Scar invade the Northland. The Northland is inhabited primarily by troll tribes. And that's one of those things that kind of comes across as a member berry, is the appearance, is the half book appearance of the Northland and the trolls. The Northland was a lot more important in several other book series, like the High Druid of Shannara, and in the Signs of Shannara, and in the Sword of Shannara specifically. The Northland makes a major, the Northland's important. But here it's just kind of a throwaway, hey, look, there are trolls, and, once they're defeated by the Scar, they don't ever become relevant. They're never relevant again. And it just feels like this is the case with every element in all four of these books. It feels like everything that appears, from the Federation, the elves, the dwarves, Paranor is sent into limbo. Driskar Ark, the main druid of the series, he's kind of like the Walker Bow of this quadrilogy, and the Alanon, he fits that archetype. Driskar Ark gets sent into the Forbidding. We get to see Wekadard again. Oh, Grianne Omsford. Okay, just bitch slapped the mug on my desk. Grianne Omsford appears again. If you read The Dark Legacy, you find out that she gets called from her slumber with the Tanaquil and gets turned into, and gets called back, and she's the Ilsa Witch. And she gets thrown into the Forbidding. And it's just, oh my gosh. It's just like all sorts of things like that. There's all sorts of really frustrating things like that, where it's just all these little ideas and concepts that never get properly fleshed out, never get properly explored. And it's just, it's hard for this series not to be a headache, because what it is, what it is basically is that in the Dark Legacy of Shannara, which I think is the last particularly good Shannara series, because the Defenders of Shannara is trash, and the Fall of Shannara is okay. The Dark Legacy of Shannara is the last time you really kind of explore any sort of new ground, I think. After Dark Legacy, everything kind of becomes about politicking and so forth, and it's boring. There's none of the magic in the books anymore. And I don't mean that literally, because of course there's magic in the books. There's Omsfords, and there's the Wish Song, and there's the Sword of Leah, and there's druids and so forth. But what I mean is that it's less about the fantastical elements and it's more about the practical elements, and that's really boring. The thing that makes Shannara so fascinating, in my opinion, is the magic. It's the elves and the Elchris and the demons of the Forbidding, and it's about the magical artifacts that they discover when they head far into the north, deep into the Eastland, or deep into the Westland, or when they explore across the sea and discover ancient technology, and have to combat that ancient technology with their magic, stuff like that, or discovering the lost elf stones in the Forbidding. Oh my gosh. And that's, I feel like, one of the biggest wasted opportunities. He explores the idea that there's 7 different sets of elf stones, not just the blue elf stones and the black elf stone, but also red elf stones, and I think there was yellow elf stone. There were several other sets of elf stones. I feel like we saw them all at one point. And they're all trapped in the Forbidding, and even though we go back to the Forbidding in the Fall of Shannara, even though we spend the last druid in the Forbidding, we never explore the idea that, well, what about all these other Elfstones? What if we retrieve the other Elfstones? What do the other Elfstones do? What's the potential of the other Elfstones? it's never explored. Instead, we spend like half our time in all these books in like the Federation war camp when they're facing off against the Scar and the incredibly boring Keter Vaus, and it's a little bit interesting in The Last Druid, but that's about it. You know, there's not it's nothing. Everything feels so stretched out and thin. Like there's all sorts of little things touched on, but nothing ever gets explored in depth. You never get like the deep storytelling. You never get the deep character development. You know, I never really, like, I sort of care insofar as I kind of like, you know, you kind of make your choice as to who's good and who's bad and who should win, who should lose, and you're kind of told that too. But you don't care. Like, I never care about the character of Tarsha Kanan at the end of the day. I don't really care about Driscoll Arc. I care more about Grianne Onsford and her reappearance than I care about any of the new characters in this story. I mean, I kind of care about Beladrin Rish, who's a Scar spy among the Federation, but that's about it. You know, I don't really care about any of these new characters. I care more about Grianne because Grianne has lived such a horrible life, and she's been trapped in the Forbidding for like 1,000 years or something like that. Or so I think it's like 1,000 years, because a huge period of time passes between the fall of Shannara and the Dark Legacy. And you feel bad for her, but that's because if you've read the previous series, you already know who Grianne Onsford is, and you already know the life she has lived, and you already know the suffering she has endured, and the more suffering she had to endure because Terry Brooks apparently can't leave this poor woman alone. And so in that regard, you care about her, but that's about it. You know, you don't care about anything else. I don't care about the Scar Princess. I freaking forgot her name. Ajin D'Amphere. All right, so, but I don't particularly care about her, and her struggle is part of the story too. Actually, part of what drives me nuts about these stories is that they are not focused at all. They're constantly bouncing back and forth between like 4 or 5 different perspectives, and it just completely kills any sort of focus, any sort of tension, any sort of like real potential. Any sort of real potential caring I could have for the story, and that's really frustrating to me. You know, it should have been more focused around 2 or 3 characters rather than 4 or 5 or 6. I'm not even sure how many. Let me think. We get this perspective of Driscoll Arc. There's Tavo Kanan, Tarsha Kanan, Darlia, Shay Omsford. Yeah, there's another Shay Omsford. Beladrin Rish, Keter Vaus, Clizia Porce, Ajin D'Amphere, I think we get a couple of other odds and ends, but they're not that important by comparison. But that's 8 perspectives. Was that 8 or 9 perspectives? Either way, that's a lot of different perspectives, and it reduces your ability to kind of get focused on a particular character, to latch onto particular characters. You don't get to see them enough. Part of what makes you care about characters is seeing them and reading about them and reading what they're doing. And that's missing. That kind of focus is missing. You know, most books in the series usually don't go beyond 2 or 3 different perspectives at a single time. And they very rarely delve into the minds of the villains, unless the villain is going to either do like a heel-face turn, or a face-heel turn. Heel-face turn is the going to the bad side, I believe. Yeah, face-heel turn. Either they're going to do a face-heel turn, or their perspective actually really is just legitimately that important and useful to the story. But besides those situations, you know, just having 2 or 3 perspectives, and none of the villains' perspectives or morally neutral parties like the Federation or whatever, it's a big part of the frustration of these books is that it's just never any real focus. I think that these books would have been better served, with more focused storylines focused around like 2 or 3 characters. Maybe Driscoll Arc, Tarsha Kanan, And it would require rearranging the story too to get maybe one or two characters, maybe three or four characters. Maybe that'd be fine, not just two or three. But to have someone focused on the war, if you want to really focus on the war, I'm not sure focusing on the war is that important, but it'd be useful. Maybe like Tarsha Kanan, Driscoll Ark, and Beladrin Rish, maybe. They would have been interesting focus characters. You know, I feel like the whole Shay Onsford and Rokan Arneas and Tyndall and the weather machine and traveling to Skarsland, that whole plotline feels super unnecessary. Like, I understand why he did it, because technology is kind of making a comeback in the Four Lands. It has been for the past couple thousand years. But it's just, it doesn't work. It doesn't work because it's too small, it's too unfocused. And it feels like it's not related to, it's related to a larger plot, but it feels like a little aside. It doesn't feel like a vitally important part of the plot. It felt very skippable. It felt like a more practical solution, a more straightforward solution to deal with the Scar would have been preferred over creating over the whole weather machine thing. But a more focused story would have been preferred. And I'm trying to think, because there's the seeds of a good story in here, but it's all just kind of lost. It's lost in the melange of the menagerie, rather. It's not the spice. It's lost in the menagerie of all the different storylines and all the different perspectives. For example, whenever Clysioporus is, by the way, the villainous druid, basically, who destroys the previous, who allows the Scar to destroy the previous order so that she could take it over and rebuild it in her image. Oh boy. Okay, hold on a second. I brought up earlier, this is probably going to come across as a little disjointed from the previous section. This is because that phone call interrupted my train of thought. But I brought up earlier how the Dark Legacy of Shannara talks about the Elfstones, the other Elfstones, the other sets of Elfstones and their potential powers and their potential abilities. And if he really wanted to bring back the Forbidding, it feels like maybe a separate story where they say Driscoll Ark gets banished into the Forbidding for 4 books, and he has to work with Rhiannon Onsford to try and free her and to find the Dark One, and maybe they find the other Elfstones and they bring the other Elfstones back. Maybe that would have been an interesting subplot if he really wanted to bring the Forbidding back. But I don't feel like he really needed to bring the Forbidding back. But on the other hand, there's the issue of Rhiannon Onsford. That kind of did have to be addressed, I guess, because, you know, she's the one who kind of unfairly got banished there, right? And he could have done something with that, and he doesn't, and it ends up hamstring, though. The whole story is hamstrung by its inability to focus. Like, for example, the elves. The elves have barely any presence in either the Fall of Shannara or the Defenders of Shannara. They obviously have a presence in the Dark Legacy because the Elcris is dying again after 1,000 years. But outside of that, there's no, like, the elves are no longer present. Like, where do they go? Why do they have so little to do with the machinations of the Federation of the Southland? You know, it's the same way in which he neglects the Eastland, but he brings back some dwarves this time from, can't remember the name of the town because it's that unimportant, generally speaking. He actually brings them back for once. You know, dwarves haven't really appeared since, like, dwarves haven't really appeared as major players since the Voyage of the Gerald Shannara years ago. The early 2000s, I think. The early mid-2000s, I think he wrote that one. You know, and it's just puzzling that there's a lot of things going through my head, basically, and it's all incredibly frustrating. I don't know. I just wanted more out of the series, I guess is basically what I'm saying. I would have liked to have seen a lot more. I would have liked to see different ideas explored. I would have liked to see better and more interesting ideas explored. I don't know. I feel like it should have been for what is being was being called the conclusion of the Shannara saga, it feels so bland and empty. For a book series called The Fall of Shannara, nothing really changes. Outside of the fact that the druids are dead again. Outside of that, there's nothing really there. There's nothing there to explore. Nothing changes. The Scar invasion doesn't succeed, and everything's basically the same. The Federation still dominates the Southland and the Eastland, and probably the Northland still, because the Scar withdrew their claims after they withdrew their army, and it's just all status quo again. There's nothing changes, nothing dramatic happens. It's all just boring, and that's the biggest sin of this. It's boring. In the Sword of Shannara and the Elfstones and the Wish Song, you're learning. You're learning about the world of Shannara, and you're learning about how magic works, and you're learning about all sorts of new things. In the Science of Shannara, you're seeing the consequences of the events that happened in that original trilogy. In the Voyage of the Gerald Shannara, you get to see something of the world before, which is explored in Word and Void in the Genesis of Shannara. And in the High Druid of Shannara, you get to see, you get more, and it builds every series builds on each one until the Defenders of Shannara, where everything kind of just seems to shrink and get smaller, and there's less. Shannara becomes a lesser place over time, and it shouldn't be like that. It should be a lot more. It should have more meaning to it, I guess. Like I said, all the it's like literally almost all the magic is gone. The druids even are bland and commonplace, and there's no, the elves aren't there, no elves or no dwarves or gnomes. The trolls are barely present, outside of as druid guards and cannon fodder. I expected more. I expected a 4-part book series to explore more too. All the stories are kind of short, they're kind of self-contained. They don't have any sort of they don't have like a proper narrative thrust, and it's a pity. It's a pity because it's, it is the conclusion to, almost 40 years of fantasy storytelling. No, over 40 years of fantasy storytelling. And that's, it should have had more to it than that. There's, something more important should have happened. The characters should have been more interesting. The plot itself should have been bigger. And yet more focused, The Scar invasion almost feels like, the Scar invasion, it feels like a footnote in the grand history of Shannara, where you had the Warlock Lord and, and protecting the Four Lands from the failure of the Forbidding, and it feels like something also should have happened to the Federation. The Federation in the Southland, it feels like something should have happened to it, because we've been watching over many, many book series. The Federation, I believe, has existed since the Scions of Shannara, and has only ever grown in power, and it's never been brought low. It's never been changed or transformed. It's never been weakened or strengthened. It feels like after all this time, like the Federation deserved a bit of a comeuppance, and it never got it. Not that the Federation's necessarily evil. Don't get me wrong. And any sort of nuanced reading of the books realizes that the Federation's not really evil. It's just that it's kind of a bit of a fascist government. And it feels like it should at least have been it should have been changed, or it should have experienced a defeat, because back in the Dark Legacy of Shannara, Arishag, the capital, is utterly devastated. By a demon attack. And it feels like when that sort of thing happens, a nation shouldn't recover and be the same, but it just is. and it never changes. It never becomes a different entity. Nothing, And I always hoped for more. I always hoped to see like the Federation get laid low and change, or at the very least, like not stop being the dominant power, or something different. Something happening to it. And that's just, again, I feel like another missed opportunity. Don't treat it as like a generic villain, but create a scenario in which it becomes the consequences of the Federation's expansion are more clearly explored, because it never is explored because outside of the attack on Arishag in the Dark Legacy, the only time the Federation's really fought directly is when an alliance of races from the Eastland and the Westland and the Northland band together to fight against them in the High Druid of Shannara, if I remember correctly. That's the only time that the Federation is fought against. And after that, the Federation's just kind of allowed to grow and expand its influence, and it becomes a dominant focal point in all the stories ever after. Which is another mistake, because the Eastland just completely disappears from any sort of storytelling. And the Westland is diminished in importance. And the Northland was never really that important after the Warlock Lord is defeated in the Sword of Shannara, but, you visited a couple of more times, at least. And it's just... I don't know. Anyway, those are my thoughts on the Fall of Shannara. It's ultimately a very, very underwhelming book series. And it's not really, I think, the conclusion that the Shannara saga deserved. It needed more. It needed more substance. It needed more to kind of capture the people, capture the audience. And I think it's sad. If anything, maybe Terry Brooks should have maybe not stopped at the Dark Legacy, but made one more series after Dark Legacy and kind of ended it on a higher note, because Defenders is a crap trilogy that doesn't even need to be told, and The Fall of Shannara is just nothing. It's just not a nothing burger. Anyway, those are my thoughts. If you've read this yourself, I'd be interested to hear yours. And otherwise, I want to thank you for watching. I know that I haven't really been upvoting recently. I'm just tired a lot lately. I don't really have that much enthusiasm for anything at the moment, so... at least I made myself make this, so that's got to count for something. If you liked it, leave a like and a comment down below, and subscribe for maybe more, probably more, but who knows how long it'll take. I definitely have another book I want to review, and I'm going to try to do that as soon as possible. But until then, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye!